How's it going, everybody? It's Kevin with another video. Today we're going to be looking at the Seamaster Professional 300M. But just not any Seamaster Professional, we are looking at the mid-size. So if you've been around my channel before, you know that I've reviewed Seamasters before, but every Seamaster I've done has always been the full-size model. Well, I decided to venture out of the box and try the mid-size model. So if you didn't know, just a little bit of history about the Seamaster. The Seamaster is an old lineup of Omega watches, but really it hit its form in the 90s, most notably because of the James Bond movie GoldenEye. And from that movie forward, the Seamaster has now held on to a certain type of style, that same style that you see here, with one major exception, or maybe a few, I should say. This Seamaster in particular was the first Seamaster to introduce ceramic to the look. So it created more of a glossy, sporty finish than the original Seamaster watch. And it also took away the wave dial. Now this watch is pretty unique for that reason because every Seamaster watch has always had wave dials. And when you look at the Seamaster Professional lineup, from the Pierce Brosnan era to what we have now, this one stands apart in the collection with having no waves. So Omega introduced a few things: a new bracelet, no waves, ceramic bezel, new case back, and this coaxial escapement. But for me, I've always been a big fan of Omega. I have an Omega Speedmaster in my collection, and my first luxury watch was an Omega. So I've always had a soft spot for Omega, and I've always loved the Seamaster lineup. But it's been one of those things that have been, I've liked it more in photos or on the wrist of other people, but as Omega has trended upwards in the size of their watch, I have found that the larger, more modern Omegas are unwearable for me, or at least they don't wear the way that I would like them to wear. They're now 42 inches across the bezel, but more notably, they're about 50 millimeters from lug tip to lug tip, which makes it a rather large and heavy watch, especially since none of their modern watches taper. This, however, fixes that for me. But sadly enough, Omega has always had a mid-sized Seamaster a part of their lineup, but for whatever reason, when they launched this latest Seamaster in 2018, they decided to discontinue the mid-size lineup. And ironically enough, they discontinued it right at the time when mid-sized, smaller-sized watches were starting to grow in popularity. And it being 2023, mid-sized or smaller-sized watches continue to grow in popularity. Funny enough, I say smaller size, when in reality I should say that many of these watches are actually coming back to normal sizing. It wasn't until really the 2000s that a lot of watches started to inflate in size. So I really like this Seamaster because even though it's smaller, it really is a beautiful size. When you compare it to the early 2000s when people were wearing 44, 45 millimeter watches, it looks very small. But now that people are starting to get back to 39 and 40 millimeter watches, this actually wears really, really nicely. So let's go ahead and take you a little bit around the watch. And for this, I'll go ahead and just begin with some of the features. So this watch has what's called the Omega's 9-link bracelet. It's not quite a Jubilee. It's not quite an Oyster, maybe somewhere in between. It has an 120 click bezel. And yes, this bezel isn't as easy to grip as a coined edge bezel, so something that you would see, for instance, on a Submariner. But I typically don't have a problem turning it. In fact, it has some of the best bezel action out there for watches that I have played with. Probably my only gripe with it is it's not perfect when it comes to grabbing it. Sometimes it can be a little bit harder to turn if your hands are really wet. Then that makes it a little bit more difficult. But I will say that this watch has the least amount of backplay that I've ever had on a watch. And that's pretty regular for the Seamasters. Even when I had a 2531, there was basically no bezel play, and that's true with this one, and I know it's true with the latest one as well. Where in fact, I've had a Submariner, and those have plenty of bezel play, but this bezel just feels really rock solid, and it doesn't move at all. I find the bezel action to be really great on this watch. So 120 click bezel to help you time things out. The intent is to time a dive, but most of us are typically timing our food, maybe an egg timer. If your kid's in timeout, you might use this to time it like that. So it is a date, and it has a date at 3 o'clock, and has a ceramic bezel, an enamel lacquered dial, and it also has a screw down crown, 300 millimeters, or 300 millimeters, that'd be terrible, 300 meters of water resistance, and then this helium escape valve right here. Interestingly enough, this is always a dividing point for people because they think it just kills the look of the watch. I don't mind it. I'm one of those guys that doesn't mind the helium escapement valve. But I will say that the newer helium escapement valve is much bigger, and it protrudes more with the watch, where this is very flat and almost flush with the watch. So I find that this valve is less intrusive to the eye, but some people say, wouldn't it be nice if they just had it like this? And I can't disagree. I think that looks nice, but the valve does not bother me at all. Hopefully I said that the caliber in this watch is a coaxial escapement. So that is a development in the watch technology where instead of a lever escapement, it's a coaxial escapement developed by George Daniels. And this is a modified ETA movement. I think it's the 2892, which means that this watch can typically be serviced by almost any watchmaker out there, since ETA is a very common caliber of watch manufacturing out there. It has super luminova. Most of the plots are blue with the exception of the minute hand and the bezel pip being green. But unless those two things are supercharged, most of the watch looks uniform under UV light. And this thing lights up like a torch at night. Better than my Rolex, better than most watches that I have owned. So let's go ahead and talk about that sizing. To help do that, I brought some calipers and wanted to take you around the watch. So it's advertised as 36.25 millimeters, but as we'll see, depending on where you grab the watch, I pull, let's see. Here we go, we'll stop right there, or we'll do from this tip to this tip. I pull about 36.4. Again, it all depends on where you grab it. Typically you go across from it like that. And you can see I get a little bit of a variation between, that's 36.5. So let's call it 36.5 or so, which is always good, right? That it wears a little bit bigger, or it actually is a little bit bigger on a smaller sized, mid-sized diver like this. So I get roughly 36.5, and I've seen some other YouTubers say the same thing, that they get a little bit larger than the advertised 36.25. And of course, if you go across the crown itself, then you're looking at a 40 millimeter watch, and that's usually the Goldilocks number right there. The lug width, or pardon me, let's do the lug to lug. The lug to lug, I usually get around, hang on, lug tip to lug tip, around 43 millimeters, around 43 millimeters or so. Oh, hang on. These are not professional grade calipers, so they're never going to be totally perfect. And another thing is because these Omegas have what's called, I'm going to go on this part of the measurement. Because Omega has these lyre lugs, so I get 43 millimeters. Because the Omega has these lyre lugs, they kind of come inward. Sometimes it's hard to get a precise lug to lug because you see how it slices inward. That really helps the watch's wearability. The thickness of the watch is under 13 millimeters, which is very, very great because the new ones I think are too thick. The new ones are about a full millimeter thicker than that. So if you can be under 13 millimeters, that typically looks really good on the wrist. So really nice proportions there. And the lug width is 18 millimeters. And I will say, because this watch does not have a tapering bracelet, the lug width being 18 millimeters looks so good on this model. So enough talking about how much I like this, how I like the way that this looks. Let's go ahead and put it on the wrist to show you. So I have a 6.5 inch wrist, and I think, boy, I think this watch looks so classy. Really nice. Really nice. So if you have a wrist under 7 inches, let's say, I think this easily could be a pickup for anybody in that category. If you have over 7 inches, I'd probably say, you know, that's going to be a preference thing, whether you like going smaller, but a full size would probably look just fine on 7-inch wrist and bigger. But boy, do I think that this wears well on my 6.5 inch wrist. And just turn the bezel. See, that time wasn't a perfect grip, but still very doable. There you go. And it just looks really good. So 36.5 millimeters wears really well. But I wanted to help you guys understand a little bit wearability. It's been my opinion that a watch is wearable based on the lug to lug. And with this lug to lug being 43 millimeters, it really helps the wearability, along with the fact that it actually has a non-tapering bracelet. I think that actually plays in this smaller sized favor. And it makes this watch also a little lighter. In my opinion, the new watch is way too heavy. It's the kind of watch that at the end of the day, you're glad to take off your wrist because it just doesn't feel as comfortable. Even though the bracelet feels comfortable, the watch is too heavy. Now this bracelet is cozy, and most people feel that way about these Seamaster bracelets, that they are very comfortable. But I wanted to give you a demonstration of sorts. So again, this is a 6.5 inch wrist. I wanted to just show you the difference in wearability. This watch, believe it or not, is a 34 millimeter watch, so even smaller. Now its true measurements are closer to 35, but nonetheless a smaller watch. But as you can see, it holds its own next to the Seamaster. And the reason being is the dial size plus the lug to lug are still good because this lug comes out versus the lyre lugs twisting inwards. So watch size can be very, very relative to where most people would say, man, I wouldn't even look at a 34 millimeter watch. But look, on a 6.5 inch wrist, it looks totally fine because there's not a dive bezel taking up the real estate of the dial, and it looks good. Now let's compare this now to another Omega fan favorite. And here is where you start to see the difference in size, because the Speedmaster has a lot of dial size. And there you can really see the difference in size of the watch. So even though the lug to lug are not far off from each other, because this is 47 millimeters, this is 43, it's that dial that makes this watch look smaller. But my eyes have gotten so used to wearing the Seamaster since I've been reviewing it that now when I look at the Speedy, it feels large. So overall, this has been a really great watch. I have found it to be very versatile. It could dress up, it could be dressed up, it could be dressed down. I find the sizing to be perfect. And my guess is that because Omega no longer offers a mid-size version in the Seamaster, and people are starting to really like these mid-size models as far as the sizing, my guess is that these are going to be harder to come by, that they're going to hold their value well, and if anything, they might even go up in value. I've already started to see, in fact, that happen where I remember when I was first into watches, you can get these mid-size for under $2,000, and most of them are in the $3,000 range now. So really, really great watch. And if you're looking for a smaller dive watch and you don't want to break the bank, so to speak, in the luxury category, then I would say this is a really good option. So hopefully that helps those of you with similar sized wrists just kind of get a look at it. And if you didn't notice, I have positioned my hand further away because I like to help my viewers see how a watch will actually wear when you look at it versus up close. Because I've noticed a lot of reviewers will film a watch right on their wrist like that, and I don't think that gives a good perspective. So I like to help you guys out and put it a little further away. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of confidence that you can enjoy a mid-size model as well. All right, well, you know the drill. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my channel. That encourages me to make more content. And I thank you for taking the time to watch this video. And the question for you on this video is, what do you prefer? Do you prefer the mid-size model or the full-size model? And do you think that the mid-size model will have a resurgence, if you will, of people wanting to pick up this sizing now that the watch trend seems to be sizing down? Let me know in the comment sections below. I love reading those comments from you guys, and I'll catch you in the next one. Doesn't that look good?